Hello friends, welcome to the first in a series of extremely fun and extremely powerful DLC builds. Today we are going to be checking out the Black Knight set and seeing how we can use their Great Hammer and Great Shield to great effect against a huge variety and quantity of enemies, from hordes of misbegotten to sniper lobsters to even soloing the divine beast dancing lion first try without a care in the world for your own well-being. Every single thing you will see in this video is obtainable from the first area of the DLC. It's all very easy to collect, and you will be able to mimic this within 20 to 30 minutes of stepping foot in the realm of Shadow. And I will be covering absolutely every single thing that you want and need to get for this build, exactly how to make the most out of it, of course what stats I recommend, and all of the other components that go into making this such an insanely powerful build for your next character. Firstly and most importantly, let's talk about the weapon itself. The Black Steel Great Hammer scales with both strength and faith, and it has a split between both physical and holy damage. For this build we will be leaning heavily into the faith aspect, and actually once we have applied the affinity that we want, it will have a triple damage type with a heavy focus on fire, as lots of enemies in the DLC are particularly weak to fire. And even those who aren't, such as the Black Knights themselves, as you'll see throughout this video, it still deals devastating damage. The only boss you probably don't want to use this exact build for is Messmer. However, you can very easily change the affinity for that specific fight, and I can talk about that later. The second reason this weapon is so good is its special guard counter mechanic. This is the only weapon in the game that actually has an improved guard counter. As you see, you shoot out this holy light on the floor, which after a brief second explodes, dealing even more damage to not only your target, but anyone around as well. And another reason that we will be using the Flame Art affinity and going for a Faith build is, as I have already spoken about many times in my pre-DLC build videos, it has been confirmed I was correct in my assumptions that Faith is very heavily prominent in the DLC. It's had a lot of love, and Faith now has the equivalent really powerful late game spells that Sorcery did in the base game, such as Comet Azure. And to make this even better, unlike the base game, quite a few late game enemies aren't super resistant to holy damage. Yes, I'm looking at you, Radagon and Elden Beast. For these reasons, the Faith stat and damage types and weapons which scale off of Faith are insanely powerful in the DLC, and this build is just absolute god tier. Now, I've swooned over the build itself enough, so let me start talking about the specifics and what other components you will need to make this absolutely devastating build for yourself. And before we move on to the next section, it's probably quite important to tell you where you get this weapon from. It's really obvious, and most people probably have it already, even if you don't know. You literally just head directly east from the starting site of Grace when you enter the DLC, and down the hill at the Church of Consolation. When you defeat this Black Knight, he will drop the Great Hammer. The first thing you'll all probably want to know is what level do I need to be, and what stat attribution do I need to make this work efficiently. You can probably get away with this build from around level 150, however from my testing, somewhere around level 175 to 178 is where you really hit the sweet spot. So, as you can see here, you obviously want 60 vigor going into the DLC. This will hit the soft cap for HP, and any extra points after 60 will start to give you diminishing returns. Next up, putting Mind on 20 is a really solid suggestion, because for those who want to use Spirit Ashes, it allows you to use, I believe, every single Spirit Ash in the game, and we want a bit of Mind because we're going to be using some Faith spells also. Next up, I advise at least 35 for endurance. More so than the equip load, you want quite a lot of stamina because you're going to be relying on guard counters. And if your stamina depletes, your guard breaks and you can no longer guard counter. So endurance is actually a super important stat. Not much of your damage will come from strength, so you only need your strength to be at 35 so you can wield both the Great Hammer and the Great Shield. You can actually get away with lesser shields and only have your strength at 25 if you aren't quite at this level yet, and I'll talk about the alternatives later. Next up, Dex, Int, and Arcane can all be left at their base stats as long as your starting class has at least 11 in Dex, so that you can wield the greathammer. And finally, pump pretty much every single remaining point into Faith. This is going to be your main source of damage, both for your weapon and your spells. Then, if you do have any extra points left over, I strongly recommend an even split between Mind, Endurance, and Strength. That's everything you need to know for the stats. So now before we move on, let me talk about the shield and alternatives. As I say, you will need 35 strength if you want to wield the Black Steel Great Shield specifically. One reason this shield in particular is absolutely incredible for the DLC, especially the final phase of the final boss, is because it has crazy good holy damage negation. And you will be faced with lots of holy attacks during that very final phase. However, if this shield is too heavy for your current level, or you only want to pump 25 points into strength for the weapon, then here are the two most important things to look out for when choosing the alternative for your shield. The first super quick and easy obvious one is do not go for a shield that doesn't offer 100% physical resistance. Every single medium shield or above offers this, and if you're going for a tanky guard counter heavy build such as this one, you cannot be using shields that don't offer 100% physical resistance. But more importantly, because again we are focusing on guard counters for a big portion of our damage, you want to choose a shield that gets your guard boost as high as you can. If you didn't know, guard boost is the stat that determines exactly how much stamina is consumed each time you guard. So shields with really high guard boost, such as the Black Steel Great Shield, mean that you are more easily going to be able to guard through entire combos, even of bosses, without running out of stamina and breaking, which not only leaves you open to attack, but also means that you would miss out on that all-important guard counter. And for that reason, I do strongly advise 35 strength and putting on this great shield, because for its weight, its guard boost is just absolutely insane. Now that we've spoken about your primary and secondary weapons, let's start taking a look at the Talismans. But before we move on to Talismans, another thing I should probably tell you is where you get the Black Steel Great Shield. For this one, you do need to have made your way to Scadu Altus, though if you didn't know, you don't need to defeat R'Larna to do so. You can use the shortcut to the southeast where you jump up the Spirit Springs into the Fort of Reprimand. Anyway, when you have made your way to Scadu Altus, just grab this Site of Grace here, Scadu Altus West. Then you can jump down the cliffs into the Fog Rift Fort, make your way along the first few sections, and over this bridge you can fight Black Knight Garou, who will drop the Great Shield. As for my talisman suggestions, I have 7 total, 3 that are kind of absolutely required, and then a few interchangeable ones for the situation. And you'll be happy to know almost all of these are actually from the base game. The first one and the literal absolute must is the Curved Sword Talisman, because this increases your guard counter damage by 20%. And as you'll see time and time again in this video, especially against the Black Jail Knight here who gave people a lot of trouble, I killed him without using a single heal. I was so irresponsible defensively, but because I was just spamming guard counters, he got melted. And that was partially thanks to the Curved Sword Talisman increasing my guard counter damage by 20%. And just in case you somehow still don't have this one yet, the location is just here in Stormvale Castle. It's actually in the room where you are ambushed by the Banished Knight when Gostok locks you in if you haven't killed him. Next up, for the times when you are focusing more on the Ash of War, because Flaming Strike, as you see, especially against the Divine Beast Dancing Lion, does insane amounts of damage, and that is partially helped by the Shard of Alexander, greatly boosting the attack power of your skills by 15%. And this one obviously drops from Alex once you complete his questline. Next up, an absolute staple for me is the Erdtree's Favor +2, giving you a health boost, a stamina boost, and an equip load boost. Really, really powerful overall in practically every situation, and this one is acquired in the Ashen Capital in the area infested with 3 tree spirits. And finally, for my other recommendation, plus the few alternatives, if you're in situations when you're planning on using some faith spells, these can be very powerful for sniping enemies from afar or just dealing crazy amounts of damage to groups of enemies. And for this, I recommend the Phlox Canvas Talisman. And this can be acquired from Gowry as part of Millicent's questline, or you can get it earlier if you don't want to finish her entire questline, just progress far enough to put Gowry in the crying state, and then kill him, and you will also get this talisman. Yes, that's right, make an old man cry, and then when he's at his absolute worst, kill him. Great, good job you. And finally, if you're not planning on using your Ash of War that often, apart from just to boost the damage to your weapon, and you're also not in a situation where you're planning on using many faith spells, then you could switch out to one of the 2 stamina boosting talismans, the Viridian Amber Medallion +2 from the base game, or the +3 from the DLC if you have that. So this is quite far into the game, this is actually in the Dark Light Catacombs. Or alternatively, you could run the new 2-headed turtle talisman to give you even more stamina recovery speed, and this one is right near the start of the game. It's inside a cave beneath a waterfall just east of Rivermouth Cave. And just in case you don't have this final talisman yet, it is very easy to get to without even killing a single enemy, and I have actually already covered this in episode 3 of the Things You Missed series. If it's not up on the channel by the time you watch this video, it should at least be available on my Patreon for all Patreon subscribers. So if you do want to support the channel over on Patreon, you will have exclusive access to that video early, along with loads of other guides and videos ahead of anyone else. Next up, we're going to talk about the mixed Physick and finally the spells, before I then give you some really important information to actually put this build together in practice. Just before we move into the mixed Physick actually, I was reviewing the video and realised I didn't even talk about the armour set. For the most part, I'm just using the Black Knight set because it's really fun to cosplay as them, but there isn't really one single armour set throughout the base game or the DLC that is going to specifically help this build. So just wear something big and tanky. You've got the endurance stat to do so, and you are going to be guarding and tanking every single attack. So just wear something that's stylish, big, and heavy. Job done. Right, now let's move on to the mixed Physick. One of the tiers in the mixed Physick is actually what gave me the idea to make this build in the first place. There is one new Physick that is an absolute must-have in this build. It works too perfectly to not use it, and that is the deflecting hard tier. You acquire this by slaying the very first furnace golem that you will see as soon as you enter the DLC, right there in Gravesite Plain, and this is the one people are referring to as the Sekiro tier. Basically, what this means is that if you time your block pretty much as an enemy hits you, similarly to with a parry, but you're just blocking, then you will trigger the deflecting hard tier and activate a spontaneous guard. What this means is you are now more resistant to damage, your poise will increase, and also your next guard counter will deal additional damage. This means blocking at the last second and then following up with a guard counter is going to be absolutely insane. As you can see time and time again in this video, it's just so ridiculously powerful, especially with the additional burst of light damage from this weapon in particular. There are a couple more tiers I would recommend for your other mixed Physick tier. The one that I recommend personally for my own playstyle, my absolute favourite for pretty much every build, is the Stone Barbed Cracked tier. You get this by defeating the Putrid Avatar near the second minor Erdtree in Caelid, and this makes your attacks more likely to break enemy stances. Meaning enemies are going to stagger more often, meaning you have more time to deal even more damage. And with certain enemies, this is actually the perfect opportunity to use your Ash of War and then go in for the critical attack. You can deal around 10,000 completely uncontested damage using this method. It is absolutely insane. However, if you don't care that much about breaking enemies' stances as often and you prefer a more defensive playstyle, the other alternatives I recommend are either of the green tiers that affect your stamina. I'm not talking about the brand new one, as that's quite situational. I'm talking about either the green spill or the green burst tier, both increasing your maximum stamina or your recovery speed respectively. Depending on which of these two areas you feel you're lacking on, either more maximum stamina or a faster regen, these two are great alternatives for your mixed physick. So just play around with these and use whatever feels best for you. As for the spells that you want to use, my friends, I always use the Frenzied Flame Seal. I swear it's the most powerful one in the game. It's amazing. And I love that it enhances Frenzied Flame incantations even further when they're already some of the most powerful in the game. Obviously, two buffs you want to use are Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength. Golden Vow is incredible because it's going to buff the pre-existing holy damage already on your greathammer, and Flame Grant Me Strength not only increases your physical damage but also increases fire damage. And in case you'd forgotten already, there's fire damage on the greathammer as well. So Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength are going to nearly double your damage output. With the Erdtree Blessing as well, I've managed to get my attack rating up to over 3,000 with just these two buffs and the rest of the build that I've already mentioned. So honestly, you are going to be doing thousands upon thousands of damage, whilst also being one of the safest, tankiest builds you've ever played. On top of these two spells, I strongly recommend two madness spells in particular. Frenzied Burst, probably the longest range spell in the game, whilst still being ridiculously powerful, especially when you fully charge it. This is incredible for sniping high priority targets. And then Unendurable Frenzy, because this will absolutely melt groups of smaller enemies. Along with these two and the two buffs just mentioned, I'd say just use whatever faith spells feel most fun to you. Another great addition is always Flame Cleanse Me in case you get poisoned or rotted and you don't have any boluses. But apart from that, just have fun and be experimental with your spells. You have so much faith in this build that pretty much every single one will do crazy amounts of damage, so use whatever you prefer. And finally, it's all well and good theory crafting, but putting these builds into action can sometimes not go very well unless you know how to use it. So let me give you my final thoughts and give you a few pointers on putting this build into action. Firstly, the one thing I will say that is only initially potentially a bit of a negative is, if anything, you have too many options. This is such a versatile build. You've got your guard counters, you've got your spells, you've got the weapon itself, which is just great even for normal R1 and R2 attacks, and then you've got the Ash of War. So it's such a versatile build with so many answers to so many different situations that the only real problem, at least until you get comfortable with the build, is that you've got access to so many different abilities you might end up forgetting some of the things that you can do. So try and not get too comfortable using one particular action. Remember your spells, remember your guard counters, remember your Ash of War. This is going to take some practice to really make the most out of it. But as you've seen, I melted the Black Gel Knight first try without even healing. I melted the Divine Beast Dancing Lion first try without any summons. And that's unlike me. I am a summoner. I really am. I'm not afraid to admit that. But this build, I have soloed the entire game with it so far. And honestly, when you get good with it and when you practice with it, you will become unstoppable. And the final thing I want to say, I have said it a few times, do not forget your Ash of War. Flaming Strike is definitely better than Flame of the Redmanes now, because Flame of the Redmanes had its stance damage significantly nerfed. So now Flaming Strike not only enhances your weapon with even more fire damage, not only does it do an insane amount of damage when you follow up with an R2, but it also does crazy amounts of stance damage. So when you combine this with your guard counters and the Stone Barb Cracked tier, you will be staggering enemies in 2 or 3 hits, even the toughest of bosses. And with that, my friends, all that's left for me to say is have so much fun with this build. And also, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.